All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So it's time for the final oil demand levels update for 2023. And as always, you will be seeing a mix of graphs. Some graphs are the purple official graphs that are just their long-term averages over time. Others are the more recent last 25 years that show the individual bi-monthly fluctuations. So not every country has those graphs yet, as I have to make those myself. But anyways, going down the list, starting with the whole world at least, the world as a whole hits another new all-time high demand record, exceeding this summer's 103.2 and hitting 103.3 million barrels per day of global oil demand. Within that total 103.3, the US remains obviously the largest consumer, hovering right around 20 million barrels per day for the last 20 years or so, having gradually adopted fuel efficiency as fuel efficiency in vehicles increased enough to keep US consumption levels the same for the last 20 years, despite the US increasing in economic activity and still increasing in population. And this time in particular, the US came in at 21 million barrels per day of consumption. China, the second largest consumer in the world, averages as of this year around 16 million barrels per day, setting a new all-time high record back in the summer of just over 18. This time they came in at 16.3. India, meanwhile, came in a bit below average, now up to usually around 5.5 million barrels per day. They came in, as of this most recent data release, a bit down, closer to 5, at 5.1 million barrels per day. Japan, once up at 6 million barrels per day, way back in the 80s and 90s, has since declined in average demand levels down to the upper threes, usually between 3.5 and 4, because of a mixture of fuel efficiency increases, massive leaning towards public transit, and the aging of their population. Since as people get older, they gradually begin going less places, doing less stuff, stop working. And for the last number of months in particular, Japan has actually been down even from that average, staying in the lower threes, this time coming in at 3.16 million barrels per day. Russia, once back in the USSR times in the 80s, had a demand level of 5 million barrels per day. Not the whole USSR, just Russia within the USSR. The whole USSR at that time, at its height, was about 7 million barrels per day of demand, while Russia within that comprised 5 million out of that 7 million. And then after the collapse, Russia's oil demand levels fell all the way down to between 2 and 2.5. And as Russia economically recovered and rose back up the last 25 years or so, Russia's oil demand levels domestically got back up to pretty close to 3.8 until the Ukraine invasion. And in the economic fallout since then, their domestic oil consumption has fallen down to sticking around 2.8 or so. This time actually coming in just a bit under that at 2.7. South Korea in present day has started leveling right around 2.8. However, they are about to enter a rapid population aging stage like Japan did previously. So their demand level domestically is actually probably about to start dropping in the coming years. This time they came in within the variability range of their usual average, just a bit down at 2.7 million barrels per day. Canada is usually around 2.5, and this time came in at 2.41 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia fluctuates across a wide range over the course of a year, much higher demand level in summer because their electricity demand, because of how hot it is there in summer, is a lot higher during those months. And they still generate about a third of their electricity from oil fired power plants, although they are decreasing that by 7% per year. So theoretically, within 4 or 5 years, they should be switched entirely over to gas with a tiny bit of solar. Although in some news releases they have admitted that they've lagged behind on their solar power adoption because they've been spending a lot of that excess money on various vanity projects like the line. But anyways, over the course of this year, Saudi Arabia fluctuated between 1.9 and 2.8 million barrels per day. As of this data release, which pertains to data for September or October, I don't remember specifically, they were a bit under 2.6 at 2.59. Brazil has gotten a bit irritating. They've stopped publishing some of their data, leaving those of us who like oil and gas and energy data having to do a bit of extra work to get a hold of it. But via math, we can still get Brazil's rough oil consumption levels domestically each time. And so the most recent domestic consumption levels for October or November were roughly around 2.2 million barrels per day. Germany is usually pretty steady for the time being at around 2.2. This time they came in a bit under average, just under 2 itself at 1.98 million barrels per day. Indonesia in present day has grown up to averaging over 2 million barrels per day in domestic consumption levels and set an all-time high of 2.56 a number of months back this year. This time, though, they dropped back down under 2 by a little bit, down to 1.89 million barrels per day. Iran, because of various economic holdups for the last number of years, decade or more or so, I believe, has has fluctuated a bit under 2 million barrels per day of domestic consumption usually, and as of the most recent data we can do math from, they came in around roughly 1.8. Mexico used to average close to 2 million barrels per day. However, since COVID, they have never fully recovered, and they've only gotten back up to 1.6. As of the present moment, they're down by a bit at 1.48. France averaged 1.6 before COVID, and post COVID is still roughly averaging 1.6. However, they've been tending to lean a bit closer to 1.7. This time, though, they came in at 1.61 million barrels per day of demand. The UK also pre COVID averaged 1.6, and since then they've not fully gone back up to 1.6. They seem to have settled to a new average of more around 1.5. This time in particular, they came in at 1.46 million barrels per day. Spain has been averaging 1.3 for a little while, and this time they came in just within range at 1.26. Italy also for the last while has been averaging about 1.3, and this time they came in close enough at 1.22. Singapore peaked up around 1.4 or 1.5 or so, and has since declined down closer to around 1.3 pre-COVID, now seeming closer to 1.2 post-COVID, and it seems that's where they're sticking, potentially decreasing further. This time in particular, they came in at 1.11 million barrels per day. Thailand was up over 1.3 and was on their way up to 1.5 before 2020. However, post 2020, they have never recovered to that. They've gotten up to 1.2 a couple times, but just haven't returned to the prior levels. And this time they came in right at 1.1. Turkey in present day has gotten up to about 1.2 on average. This time in particular, they came in just a bit under 1.2 at 1.15. The UAE in present day is up to a domestic oil consumption level of 1.1 million barrels per day. They don't normally publish monthly consumption data, but working backwards through math, I was able to get their most recent numbers, and they were basically right around 1.1 million barrels per day, as well as Australia coming in at 1.1, which is their modern day usual average. The Netherlands was usually around 1 post COVID for a little bit, though the last number of months they've been a bit further down in the 900s. This time in particular, coming in at 938,000 barrels per day. Taiwan was previously around a million usually. However, over the last year and a half or so, they've kind of slipped down to staying closer to 900,000 on average now. This time in particular, they're down by a decent bit at 778,000 barrels per day. Iraq, meanwhile, was in the 800,000s. However, over the last year, they've constantly been further up in the 900,000s, usually even close to 1 million. So they might be starting to stay around here as their usual level. This time in particular, they came in at 953,000 barrels per day of domestic consumption. Malaysia is usually in the 800,000s nowadays and should probably be leveling off here soon. This time they came in a bit down below average at 630,000 barrels per day. Egypt is also usually in the 800,000s, and they came in right at exactly 800,000 this time. Poland has also grown up to about 800,000 on average now. This time they came in at 780,000 barrels per day. Belgium is normally up between 650 and 700. This time they came in a bit down at 618,000 barrels per day. Argentina is normally around 700,000 in present day. And working out through math, it looks like this time they came in right around 610 or so. Nigeria in present day for the last number of years was averaging pretty close to 600,000. However, for the last number of months, they have had an abrupt crash in demand levels. I'm not exactly certain what's going on in the country at the moment. They've been down closer to 400,000 for the last number of months, this time coming in at 430. The Philippines in present day is close to being around 500,000 on average. And they haven't updated for a number of months, but the last time they did, a few months back, they were at 467. Algeria in present day is usually around 450 now as of this year, and this time they came in at 445. Vietnam had gotten close to 600,000 pre-COVID and post-2020. It's taken them a while to recover back up to those levels. However, they've been pretty close this year, and it looks like this time they may have just broken their all-time high demand record, coming in at 606,000 barrels per day. Chile, meanwhile, is usually around 400,000 in present day. This time came in at a demand level of 396. Colombia in present day, usually around 500,000 now. This time, though, they came in a bit under 400,000. Kuwait, once up closer to 500, is now usually closer around 400 after switching out a lot of their oil-fired power generation. This time, though, they came in suddenly down all the way at 277. Kazakhstan in present day is up in the 400s. And this time they came in close enough, just a bit under it at around 390. Sweden in present day is usually staying around 300 and came in right within range at 293. Greece is also normally around 300,000, and this time they came in at 321. Morocco is usually around 300,000 now, and they haven't released data for a few months, but last time they were at 313. Venezuela used to be up around 700 or 800 before they completely collapsed, and obviously their domestic oil consumption collapsed with them, down to only around 250. Now, though, after the last few years, they've gradually grown back up to averaging between 300 and 350, this time coming in at 304. Peru still hasn't updated in a while, but last time they updated, they came in at 283, which was their highest ever. Ecuador in present day is averaging up over 250, sometimes as high as 270 or 280. This time, though, they came in down closer to around 220. Romania in present day is usually around 250, and this time they came in at 238. Portugal is also usually around 250, and this time they came in a bit down at 212. Then we have a decent list of countries that are all usually in the lower 200s, starting with Austria, usually in the lower 200s. This time coming in decently elevated at 255. The Czech Republic, usually in the lower 200s, this time coming in right within range at 228,000 barrels per day. Hungary, usually in the lower 200s, came in a bit down at 183. Switzerland, usually in the same range, and came in within range at 203. Finland, usually in that same range, came in decently down at 166. And Norway, also usually in that same range, and they came in right within normal range at 229. New Zealand in present day, usually around 180, and it took them almost all initial 3 years post-COVID to recover back up to that. And this time they came in a bit down at 159. Ireland's usually around 150 or 160, and they came in right at 150. Denmark, usually around 150, and they came in a bit up, actually, at 165,000 barrels per day. Angola, in present day, usually up around 140,000 barrels per day of demand. This time they came in down at 122. Azerbaijan, usually around 120 or 130, and this time they came in at 121. And finally, Tunisia, usually pretty steady around 100 for the last number of years. And the last time they updated a few months ago, they were just within range at 96,000 barrels per day of demand. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. Tons of links are in the description to various Google Docs with all kinds of energy and resource, economic, demographic, data compilations, graphs and charts of all kinds. The link to my cat's channel will be in the top pinned comment as always. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.